If you and I were to get into a time machine and go back 1,800 years to one of the major cities of the Roman Empire, Caesarea, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and we go and find the early Christian community in one of these major cities, and we just stand back like a fly on the wall, and we just watch them for a while. What would we observe about these early Christian communities? What would we learn about them? Well, the first thing I want you to understand is that in that era of church history, Christianity was growing explosively. Sociologists, historians estimate that from the time this thing began in the early 30s AD until about 300 AD, in that 270-year period, the church was growing at a rate of 40% per decade. So that what started with 120 believers, by the year 300 has now exploded to about 6 million believers, which is about 10% of the Roman Empire, 40% per decade. Here's the thing, though. This is going to freak some of you out. They had no evangelism. They had no outreach events. They had no stadium crusades or anything like that. For one thing, Christianity was outlawed. It was illegal to be a Christian. So they weren't going out doing formal outreach and evangelism. And even on a personal level, let's say that you're one of these early Christians living in like Alexandria, and you're like, man, I'm going to go to my next door neighbor and tell him the gospel and tell him about Jesus. The elders of the church would say, no, don't do that. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to mess it up. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't talk about Jesus in public. So they had no outreach, no evangelism, the way we think of it today. They also had no missions program. They weren't sending out missionaries after that first generation of apostles. Now, when you read the book of Acts, you'll see that, yes, the church was in that era sending out Paul and Silas and Barnabas, and they were going out planting Christian communities in these urban cities, in these urban centers. But after that first age of apostles, after that generation, until several centuries later with like St. Patrick, for example, in that span where the church was growing explosively, they weren't doing missions. They weren't sending out missionaries. I know, it's mind-blowing, right? Like we think of the Great Commission, Matthew 28:19, go therefore into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I commanded you. Well, the early Christians, I'm not saying they were right here, I'm just telling you this is how they thought. In their mind, that whole part about going out and making disciples of all of the nations, for the early church, in their minds, that's already been done by that first age of apostles. They knew it wasn't, but for them the seeds were planted, in other words. They actually used that verse not as motivation for evangelism, they used it to teach the Trinity. So there were no missionaries, there were no outreach programs, certainly no church growth conferences, and yet they're growing explosively. How did they grow? Well, the lives of these early Christians were found attractive by these pagans. They looked at these communities and said, look how they live. How beautiful is that? And they were drawn to it. Now, you have to understand, here's the other thing, and this blows my mind as a pastor. It was super hard to join a church in that era. Like these days, in our day and age, we practically beg people to come attend churches. But in that era of Christian history, in that 270-year era of Christian history, it was the opposite. They actually were very concerned about who they admitted into their worship services because they didn't want informants in their gathering. Remember, Christianity was outlawed. You can't just allow anybody. So they would actually put people at the doors, usually big burly men like Armand back there. They would put these big men and they would make sure that everybody comes in is a baptized member of their community. And if you weren't, then you weren't allowed to come in. So think about it. It's interesting. In our churches, we put greeters at the door. The early Christians, the early churches, they put bouncers at the door. So you say, well, how could you be a part of this thing? No outreach? No missions. They won't even let you in unless you're a baptized. How did this thing grow 40% per decade? Well, it worked like this. Imagine you are a pagan person in ancient Rome. You live in ancient Rome on the outskirts, and all you know is Roman paganism. But you got a neighbor across the street. Let's give him a name. We're going to call him Julius. And you look at Julius, you get to know Julius, and you see him, and you know he's a Christian. You've kind of heard through the grapevine that Julius is part of this subversive community called Christians. And you just watch Julius's life, and you find it so compelling and so intriguing. He's got such a peaceable life. And you just start craving that. So you go to Julius, and you say, Julius, man, I've been watching you. I got to tell you, I want what you have. I want to be a Christian. I want to join your church. What do I have to do? And Julius would say, are you sure? Sometimes we get persecuted. And you would say, yeah, but it just seems like you Christians, you just have so much peace in your life. Yeah, we do. Well, I want that. I want to join your church. I want to become a Christian. And Julius would say, well, let me see what I can do. And Julius would take you to one of the teachers, one of the elders of the church. And the elder would actually interview you to make sure that you're serious about it. And one of the first things you find out is if I'm going to join this church, if I'm going to begin that process, there are certain professions that I'm not going to be able to stay in. Okay? For the early Christians, there were 4 professions that if you wanted to join, they would immediately require you to leave that profession and find something else to do. I'll tell you the 4. Some of them are going to surprise you. First one is you couldn't be a gladiator and join the church. You know, that was just a lifestyle of bloodthirst and violence and all of that. So if you were a gladiator, they wouldn't let you come. You'd have to leave that profession. You couldn't be a prostitute and join the church. And that had more to do with temple idolatry and the association with prostitution. So you couldn't be a gladiator, you couldn't be a prostitute. The third one's going to surprise some of you. You couldn't be an actor. You couldn't be an actor and join the church. Why? Well, it's very simple. All of the plays that were being written and performed were all glorifications of Roman paganism, right? So you couldn't be an actor. And then the fourth one, this one's a little bit more nuanced, is if you were a soldier. Now, you couldn't join the church and then become a soldier, but if you were already a soldier coming in, they would allow you to stay and remain a soldier, but you had to take a vow not to take human life, even in war. I'm just telling you, this is what our ancient fathers and mothers in the church, this is how they functioned, this is how they practiced. And so once that was established and the elder said, okay, this person's serious, what would happen is you would then begin a program that averaged about 3 years before you could be baptized, before you could attend a worship service. You had to go through a program of about 3 years. And you were not yet considered a Christian. You were more like a Christian in training. And all throughout that 3-year period, periodically, Julius, your sponsor, it's kind of like a 12-step program. Julius would be your sponsor. And Julius would meet with the elders of the church, and they would quiz him every so often, like, how's this person doing? Are they growing? Are they being formed in the virtues of the faith? And during this 3-year period of preparation, their focus was not on doctrine. They didn't teach you doctrine until the very end, like 2 weeks before you get baptized on Easter. They would save doctrine for the very end. Rather, their focus was on lifestyle. Lifestyle. That's what's important. Because in their minds, hey, we can straighten out this person's doctrine in like half an hour. We'll just save that for the end. But the big challenge is we got to get these people to live differently. And so that's what they would focus on. You would go through that 3-year process. And when the elders were satisfied, now you can finally get baptized. And it would always happen on Easter. But there were 2 things that would happen before baptism. Is first of all, finally they would start teaching you doctrine, which they called the divine mysteries. I like that term. They would teach you the divine mysteries. And then the last thing they would do before you get baptized, this is going to throw some of you off, is they would perform exorcisms on the new converts. They would do an exorcism because in their mind, this person's coming out of paganism. In the Roman world, their whole life, they're bound to have some demons. We don't want to bring that into the church, so we're going to perform an exorcism on you. And for the early church, there were 5 things in particular that carried the touch of the demonic. The first one was sexual immorality, which was pervasive in the Roman world. Idolatry, which was also pervasive in the Roman world. Number 3, greed. They said, that's a demon. We got to get rid of that. So you'd have to say, I renounce greed. Number 4, violence. And number 5, this will shock some of you, xenophobia, fear of foreigners. They said, oh, that's a demon. Because the Church of Jesus Christ is global. It transcends all these ethnic barriers. So if you hate or are afraid of foreigners, you didn't learn that from Christ. You learned that from the devil. You're going to have to renounce that. We're going to cast that spirit out of you. So ultimately, you think about all of that. Everything that was working against the growth of this movement. No outreach, no evangelism, no missions. You couldn't even enter a worship service unless you've gone through a 3-year process of changing the values of your life. It was illegal to be a Christian, and yet this movement was spreading like wildfire. Why? Ultimately, it was the traits, it was the lives of these Christians that these pagans found appealing, nearly irresistible.